This is week 4, chapter 4 on political participation. So let's get right into the questions. The first question is why people don't participate beyond the act of voting. Why is it that so few people really participate in politics? If you think about it, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. Join an interest group, write letters to members of Congress and or to your state legislature, go visit your local city hall whenever they're doing sessions that are open to the public. There's all kinds of ways of political participation. And if you look in the book, I think you'll see a list of some of the things that people do. So why is it that people occasionally vote and that's about it, and they don't do anything else? The kinds of people that participate, that engage in political participation, usually have leisure time and energy. That means generally they're college-educated people in the upper classes of society, where they have a flexible work schedule. I grew up in a blue-collar home, and one thing I can tell you in those days, and it probably still exists the same way today, and that is that there's very little energy after you get home from work. And so you have no desire to do much more than just kind of collapse in front of the TV and watch some mindless television. And you don't have a whole lot of leisure time either. And that's becoming more of a problem even for white-collar workers as well as blue-collar workers in American society today, because it just, people are working harder than ever. I've seen studies that show that large numbers of people, I forget what the exact percentage was, eat lunch at their desk. So they don't even take the hour for lunch. So the fact that people don't have leisure time, nearly as much leisure time as they once did, and they're exhausted when they get home, that means that things like politics are generally avoided. They only want to do what is pleasurable, and that can't be pleasurable when it takes a lot of effort on your part. The second thing is alienation. We seem to see a lot more political alienation than we ever did before. People, mainly because, I would say mainly because the society is much more critical of leadership than it used to be. And it's not just political leadership, it's all leadership. Whether you're talking about faith in your doctor, or faith in your church, or faith in your president. The fact is that people don't think that way anymore, and as they once did, largely because of scandals. It probably began with President Nixon and the Watergate, where people realized that the president isn't this guy we were told about in grade school. So over time, people have less and less faith in all the institutions surrounding them. I remember when doctors, when I was a kid, doctors used to make visits to your house, and it was just routine. He had his black bag and he'd come to the house if somebody was sick, and we all saw him as a healer. So if he said, you're going to be okay, you just had the flu or something, you immediately began to heal, and the body began to heal itself because we had faith. We just had faith in the doctor, even though we had no idea of where he went to medical school or any of that kind of stuff. But today is a different world. There's criticism of everything and everybody, and that leads to alienation, a feeling that these people, whoever they are in authority, don't represent me. Another characteristic of modern society, the 21st century, is apathy. We just don't have the kind of idea that we have a responsibility for civic duty. There's a sense my responsibility is to myself and to my immediate family, and that's it. And so people who are apathetic generally avoid politics. Um, Leading up to is the next one, distrust of politicians and politics. There's a tremendous amount of distrust. We don't trust anybody. I think one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton lost the presidency was because people don't trust her. They didn't trust him, her husband, and they don't trust her. And no matter what she said, even if she said all the right things, it didn't really work to get her to be elected president because of the high levels of distrust. People don't like any of the candidates in a given election. Part of that is due to the fact that people are alienated and distrustful, but it's also partially due to the fact that there's so much negative campaigning that goes on. People, the candidates, will say to themselves or see the polls, and the polls will show that the public doesn't really like them very much. I mean, all you got to do is look at the, say, presidential popularity polls. You know, do you think the president, the question asked is, do you think the president is doing a good job? And if you go back to the 1950s and 1960s, presidents were generally regarded as doing a good job. They were in the 70 percentiles all the time. And now, if you look at the president, and it's not just Trump, but presidents in the past 20 years, the tendency is for the ratings not to get much higher than in the 50s and oftentimes just in the 40s. So people don't like the candidates, and when they realize that people don't like either candidate, then they start negative campaigning. And when they do this negative campaigning, basically what they're saying is, I know you don't like me, but the other guy's even a bigger sleazeball than I am. And so that leads to more and more negativity on the part of the public. If the candidates were nice to each other, if they treated each other with dignity, it would be a different story. And you know, you don't have to go very far reading the news or watching television news or any of that to know that candidates are awful to each other. They're just awful. The last thing is they see social action as more profitable than political activity. People would, in other words, people would rather do something else if they're going to contribute their time. Like, for example, people will volunteer at an animal shelter or volunteer at the hospital or something like that, and see that as more beneficial to themselves and to society than any kind of political activity, especially joining up and working for a political party or a candidate. Second question is, why is there less voting as you go down the levels of government? In other words, the highest number of people will vote for president of the United States, and when you go to the state level, the highest number of people will vote for the governor, but that's considered oftentimes is considerably less than the numbers of people that vote for the legislature, particularly at the state and local level. So, and if you go to the local level and get into things other than city government, in big cities, if you go to all the rest of the, you know, like medium-sized cities, small cities, and then all the special districts like school board election, sanitary board, and all that kind of stuff, which we'll talk about later. If you go down to these different levels, executive and then legislative, and then judicial, and then special district, you see the numbers of people going down in terms of the people that vote all the time. And it's not uncommon, for example, to have less than 10 or 15% of the public voting in any special election for school board or county board or any of these kind of things in most places. So why is that? Why does the number of people go down, or the fewer people vote in these elections as you go down the scale? The first thing is there's less interest in state and local politics than there is in the national level. Almost everybody knows when the presidential election is going on, and they're aware of it, and they're aware of who the candidates are, and they have a preference, whether they vote or not. They have a preference for one of the candidates. But you don't have that kind of interest and knowledge and levels at the state level or at the local level, particularly when you get into things like the legislative branch and the judicial branch. The second thing is less campaign coverage. The campaigns are almost never covered in the same kind of way as the national government is. If you just look in the newspaper or watch a television newscast, you'll see that most of the news is national. There's always talk about the president. There's almost always talk about what's going on at the national level, especially if there's a foreign policy issue. A lot of coverage. State and local, not so much. Probably the only coverage you can find is going at the state and local level is going to be government in a big city, or like Chicago, or some kind of gubernatorial information, especially if there's a problem, like there's a scandal. Then you're going to get a lot of coverage. Other than that, the day-to-day activities and so on are ignored, whether that's at the state level or at the local level. Also, the same thing happens during the campaigns. You know, when when there's a presidential campaign, there's a huge amount of coverage. When there's a campaign for local office or state office, even the gubernatorial office, the coverage is much, much less. Another thing is that there's less prestige. People don't get out in these state and local elections because they don't see it as nearly as important as voting for presidential politics or congressional politics. So there's much less prestige. The offices themselves seem to have less prestige too. People don't really spend a lot of time trying to get these offices. Most of the people running for office are first-time candidates. So you could see that there isn't a whole lot of prestige. There's a lot less campaigning, often no TV at the state and local level. And if there's no television coverage, especially when you look at like advertising, candidates advertising on television, if they're not using television, they're just using billboards or yard signs or having some people go door to door and pass out literature, then that is way less politics, way less campaigning than you would have at the national level. And then the last one is there's less knowledge of the candidates and the offices they run for. Most people have no idea if it's a complicated, say, city government where you have a mayor and a city manager in the same situation, same city. They have no idea what the responsibilities of the mayor are, what the responsibility of the manager is. So it's like that, and you just go with any office, somebody running for the school board, somebody running for library board or whatever it is. The average person has no idea what these people do. So if you don't know what they do, and the same thing goes for judicial politics as well. We elect most of the judges who serve at the state level in America. Most people really have no idea who these judges are, or what they do, or anything. There's almost no campaigning. And so all of those things result in fewer and fewer people showing up, so that, like I said, it's not uncommon for 10 or 15% of the public potential voters to actually vote. Number three, how do we increase the numbers of people at the polls? Well, we can make it easier for people to vote. We can have weekend voting. One of the criticisms of voting on a Tuesday is that a lot of people are at work or have to make a real sacrifice to show up at an election, especially if there's a line showing up either before work or after work. You know, many people are exhausted, but they wait in line and all of that kind of thing. So that takes a real sacrifice. But if we did what the Europeans do, that is have weekend voting, devote a whole weekend to it. People are off on the weekend and they can go at their leisure. So that would be one kind of thing you could do. Another thing would be to change the registration laws. One of the things that happens to people is oftentimes they get interested in voting right before the election. And by that time, because of the way registration laws are set up, it's too late. You can't register like a couple of weeks before. So we should have registration all the way up until the election day. Online voting is another thing. I used to talk about this in class when I was teaching in the classroom all the time. I thought online voting made a whole lot of sense if we really are interested in getting people to the polls. You know, we do, you know, the criticism against it is, oh, it's going to be corrupt and they're going to steal the elections and all that kind of stuff. Well, they do that now. And it seems to me that the most important thing in America is money. And if we can do online banking, we should be able to design a system that's secure enough so that we could do online voting. Another thing is we need better candidates. One of the things that struck me many, many years ago, probably about 40 years ago, is that the Democrats and the Republicans have run out of ideas. They don't know what to do. And there's all these problems in our society. You know, you can list them as well as I can. And yet we don't really see very many candidates often who stand up and say, you know, I got a real good solution to this. It seems to me like that's the reason people should be running, not running because they want the job or they like the salary or they like the prestige. No, it should be because they really have answers. And I think that's a problem. We need to find better candidates who really do have answers. They might not work, but at least we could try them. We need to change the party system. We need to allow third parties in. Right now, it's the Democrats and the Republicans, and they seem to be on this treadmill type situation where they're not going anywhere. So we need to allow opportunities for third parties to participate so that people could have some choice. Right now, and we'll talk more about this later, but right now one of the biggest problems is that the Democrats and Republicans take money essentially from the same people. And so they don't offer alternatives, not really. They don't offer real alternatives. We can maybe talk about that later. The last one is address the issues. Stop dealing in personalities and start addressing the real issues. Everybody says they want to do that, and nobody does. So if we were to do some of these things, any of these things, you can increase the numbers of people that actually show up. I think one of the main reasons, this is personal opinion, but I think one of the main reasons why it doesn't happen, why we don't have, say, weekend voting or online voting, is because the people who are in power got elected by the people who voted. And they don't want to see the electorate enlarged because they're afraid that they'll get kicked out. Okay, the last one is who votes and who doesn't. Well, it seems to me that you can divide all this answer into three categories. There's social reasons, which I have identified as social class. The second would be psychological reasons. And the third one would be political. So if you think about that, and this will help you, I think, in terms of being able to answer almost any kind of question, to think of it in terms of social, think of it in terms of psychological, and think of it in terms of political. Those three components. Well, let me give you the specifics. In terms of social, basically, I said there's social class. If you look at social class in America, you know, the upper classes, that is, people who are in white-collar jobs, college educated, making a considerable amount of money, living in good communities. Those people at that level are much more likely to vote than people who are on the other end of the scale, poor, uneducated, living in sort of poverty, living in poverty or on the edge of poverty. Those people living, if you look at the low end of the scale, they don't have much going for them. And they're not likely to think about politics as a way to improve their situation. Whereas the upper social classes, they have the opposite view. And then the middle class is somewhere in the middle in terms of their participation levels. Level of political interest, and that's kind of psychological. The level of political interest is important. Do you really care about politics? Do you see politics as something important? A lot of people don't. Another one is political efficacy versus alienation and cynicism. Alienation and cynicism is one end of the scale. Political efficacy is the other. Political efficacy, what that means is that you have a sense that you make a difference, that you can change things, that your vote counts. All of those kind of positive concepts associated with politics is called political efficacy. And the opposite would be people who feel alienated and cynicism and, you know, just think that nobody's out to help them. Politicians stand for somebody else, not them, and so on. The next thing would be a sense of community versus a feeling of isolation. And again, this is kind of psychological more than social. That is to say that people have a sense that I'm part of this community and therefore I need to participate. I know the people around me and they are people like me and therefore I need to participate. Whereas isolated people, and you often find that in big cities, you know, that people feel isolated, they don't know who their neighbors are, even though they live in a big apartment building, they never do more than say hi to each other. There's a feeling I'm by myself, I'm alone. And if there's that feeling, then there's a tendency not to participate. So if you have a sense of community, you're much more likely to vote. And then if you don't have that sense, you're less likely to vote. And then the last one is a social support system. That is, you have people around you who encourage you to do these things. So if all your friends and your neighbors and people are coming up to you and saying, we should go vote today, that becomes a stimulus then for you to do it. And if they don't do it, you know, they're just watching the game or they're going to the bar or something like that, and you might not even know it's election day. Well, I hope all of that was of some help.